Archaeology has been a quite remarkable help to the understanding of the Bible. And sometimes it's really been quite a great force in comprehending earlier and ancient peoples and their customs and circumstances, sometimes about their economy and their religion, their family life and their community ways. Archaeology is not everybody's first scientific interest, but nevertheless it has opened our eyes to remarkable detail in the history of human life and activity which would not have been available. It definitely would simply just not have been available if we had not had the science of archaeology. For example, this is what we would know about Babylon if we didn't have archaeology. That was what was found about Babylon when it was discovered, finally, in Iraq. And it doesn't tell you too much, does it? That's what people knew about Babylon. So much so that people doubted that the kingdom of Babylon ever existed. Or they said the Bible's made up its own stories about Babylon and Nineveh, and they really didn't exist. Why so? Well, we can't find them. We've never found them. We've got no idea where they were, and we haven't got any record of their behaviour in our current world. That's what a lot of people thought in the 19th century, when the higher critics began to mount their offensive against the Word of God. Of course, people before that time had believed in Babylon because it's clearly mentioned in Scripture. But there's not much known when all we have is a hill, and even that, of course, was not until the middle of the 19th century before that was found. You know that Babylon was a city of 15 miles by 15 miles. Huge walls, wide enough to run a number of chariots down the walls, in the midst of the walls. Amazing place. It was able to sustain itself against invasion simply because it had so much water passing through, which they had channeled off into various streams, that their sheer food production was sufficient to continue to make them safe in time of siege. It was a vast city, and yet people got to think that it didn't really ever exist. And when they came into that area, all they found was swamps and birds, storks and other water birds that desired to live in that area. It was actually, I remember reading, 5 times the size of London in the mid-1900s when it was found. That is, Babylon in its full dress was 5 times the size of London when Babylon was found in the mid-19th century. It was a place of spectacular palaces and hanging gardens, which have now become famous and so on. One of the 7 wonders of the world. This one is a sketch of what was found of Nineveh. And Nineveh was in the same position. Many high critics had got to the point where they laughed at Nineveh. They said, you've simply made up a story. The Bible refers to this kingdom of the Assyrians, and their capital city is Nineveh, but where is it in history? And it didn't really exist. And the same story, of course, was there because they couldn't point to evidence of where Nineveh actually existed. There was a kind of sweeping mound of what seemed to be just sand, and people had treated it as a sand dune. But then in the 19th century, in the first part of the 19th century, towards the middle, I suppose, of that century, there was a man called Mr. Rich. He was an Englishman, and he was in that area for some reason involving his business, his government responsibilities. And he just happened to turn over some of this mound of sand, as it was always thought to be, and he thought, I don't think that's really sand. There's a grittiness about this. In fact, there's something in it. there's something that's been fabricated in it. It's not just sand. And so he began to dig, and he confirmed that it wasn't just sand. This wasn't a wind-swept mound of sand. This was indeed some ruins of some ancient place. And the story then goes to Mr. Botter, who was a Frenchman, and he was appointed out in that area for some reason, and he went through the same process of in trying to discover just what it was. Must have been a fascinating, exciting experience, wasn't it? No one out there knew anything about it. No one in the Western world had a blue clue what happened at Nineveh, or who it was, or what it was, or who they were, the Assyrians. And now, in the middle of the 19th century, we've got our spade in our hands and we're chopping down through this material, and all of a sudden it goes clunk and hits something very strong and obviously built. So, of course, Mr. Bottom, Mr. Richer, and then Henry Layard, he was the third one, you've probably heard of him. Henry Layard, he was also English. They decided they would have to clear the rubble and just see what was beyond there, making this very strong sound. There was obviously something built, and as they did, they came upon a great wall, and they continued to remove the sandy material until eventually they had a wall some feet thick, and it was some many feet high, and had obviously been much, much taller in earlier times. What would you make of that? If you were in that circumstance, you would think you're really discovering something that was super interesting. Everybody took the place to be nothing more than a swampy desert as far as Babylon was concerned, and this just a dry piece of wind-swept sand. And suddenly you've got evidence that there's been some very major construction in this very same place. Well, Nineveh too was a very great city in its own time. It was the most spectacular city in the world at that time. It surpassed Babylon. Its palaces were the greatest in the world during its time of its zenith. As a matter of fact, they used much of the stones of Babylon to build the city of Nineveh, because there weren't stones around. You couldn't just go around to the quarry that was nearby, because there wasn't any quarry. There was no cliffs of rocks and so on. So what they did is go and take the building materials of Babylon and incorporated those into the magnificent palaces that they were discovering had been built at Nineveh. Well, I'll tell you what I really think is very fascinating about this story. Do you know what people did when they discovered that? They were so excited about that they wanted to get it to the public eye, because most people had kind of come to think that it was just a story in the Bible. But the British authorities, the French authorities, and to some degree the German authorities too, who were also by now involved in it, they began to take sections of it that were interesting, something that had a depiction of an animal or coloured marble or other works of art. And they boarded that onto floats, which they put onto the Tigris River, because the city of Nineveh was on the Tigris River. And of course they didn't have the ready pumped up floats that we might have today, so they pumped up these skins of animals, considerably larger, but nevertheless just skins of animals. And if you had enough of them, you could make the float quite large. And if therefore there was good floating capacity, you could put some of these great creatures that they had found, these works of art in Nineveh, you could put them on the float, run them down the Tigris River, down to the Persian Gulf, put them on the English or French or German ships, and take them back to your capital cities. So did you know that in London, in Paris, and in Berlin, there are to this day significant indications of what Nineveh really was like? If you were to visit London today, it's very likely that you'll be asked if you'd like to see the British Museum. And if you did, that's what you'd find, Nineveh. Is that interesting? I think that's really interesting, don't you? I don't even believe that that was really accident. Here was a cynical world that had begun to think the Bible didn't really mean what it said. And then all of a sudden this Mr. Rich and Mr. Botter and Mr. Layard came across, almost accidentally, like it was just in the holidays almost, they came across this evidence that led to those three countries, particularly England, putting in the best known museums in the world, the London, the Paris and the Berlin museums, which at that time would have been the three principal museums in the Western world, wouldn't it? There was this very ornate display in every one of them of the marvellous detail of the scriptural record. And eventually, nobody said Nineveh never existed. It just quietly went off the record. And I think that's how God sometimes answers his critics, until he provides the evidence, until it becomes embarrassing to the opposition and they just quietly walk out of the room and leave the debate. The Bible was correct. And what it said about Nineveh and Babylon was obviously true. The word of God was vindicated. So that's what archaeology at its best has done in the work that it has done in many, many places in the world, particularly, of course, in the land of Israel. It has vindicated the record of Scripture in 1,000 times. I think something similar to that story is being played out in the world today. Sodom and Gomorrah are still, to most people's memory, as statements of infamy. They have a record, don't they? They have a record of a way of life which has actually been given to the very way of life itself. The morality of Sodom and Gomorrah has clung to it because that kind of morality is called sodomy. And it's, until more recent times, it was a name of infamy. I can remember in the city of Adelaide, for example, some policemen got hold of somebody who wanted to carry on in this way in the local park and put him in the Torrens River. He probably thought it was fun, but he ended up in jail because the record was changing. The view that people took to that kind of behaviour was being changed gradually. Was there therefore never a Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, people doubted that too. Where is it? Show me where Sodom and Gomorrah are in the world. And no one knew quite where to go. If you're going to remember the outline of the Dead Sea, you remember that on the right-hand side, on the eastern side, there was a little peninsula that came in to the Dead Sea. And it was believed that it was somewhere around that little peninsula where those those four cities were found. In fact, I remember when I used to be a contributor to the Arcaeological Review, a magazine that was published by archaeological people, it actually told that story, that that's where they believed Sodom and Gomorrah were. And a lot of people did believe that that actually was where those cities were in that position. Well, not too many people talk that way because they've discovered that the Dead Sea is 1,300 metres on its surface, below the level of the sea, but the bottom of the Dead Sea is 1,200 feet again to the base of that sea. So although the Russians at one stage, to sort of clear up the matter, thought that they might actually put a little submarine in there to just discover what might in fact be around that little peninsula and so on, they gave the idea away when they realised how deep it was. So Sodom has been of curiosity to people. Where was this place? Why don't we know about where it was? Well, in our record that we read tonight from Genesis chapter 13, we have one of the stories that has to do with Sodom and Gomorrah. And I just want to sketch this story. If you've got chapter 13 there, let's have a little look at it. Chapter 13 says that Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south. So Egypt is south of Palestine, isn't it? So he's going into the south of Palestine, or Israel as we might call it today. He's coming out of Egypt into the south of Israel or Palestine. Abraham was very rich in cattle and silver and gold. He went on his journeys from the south even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai. In that place, verse 4, he had built an altar when he was there before he went down into Egypt. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. So it had a connotation with Abraham, a place where he'd spoken to God in time past and made offering to him in that place. And so having come up out of Egypt, he went to this place to recall his allegiance to God. Now he had with him, you might remember the story, that he had with him his nephew whose name was Lot. And he did have a lot. He had a lot of flocks and herds and tents. Verse 5. The land was not able to bear them. Abraham had very great possession, verse 2. Livestock as well, verse 2. And so did Lot, flocks and herds and tents. And so the two of them together represent a large number of people and a lot of livestock. So, verse 6, the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. And even if they liked each other as uncle and nephew, which they were, their workmen were not too pleasant with one another, as workmen so often aren't. There was a strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled then in the land. So their herdmen, very loyal to their masters, were contending about who was going to put their cattle here and who was going to put their cattle there. It grieved Abraham, the uncle, and so he said to verse 8 to Lot, his nephew, "Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdmen and thy herdmen, for we be brethren." They were from the same stock, weren't they? Lot was a cousin, was a nephew, really, of Abraham. So it just didn't seem seemly that among other strangers in the land of promise, they should be at sixes and sevens between themselves. Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdmen and thy herdmen, for we be brethren. Look, isn't the whole land before thee? Said Abraham to Lot. Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou depart to the right, then I will go to the left. So Lot had the first decision, which was very generous of Abraham, who was clearly the senior partner of the company. And this is what Lot did. Think about this. It's very interesting. Lot lifted up his eyes to make a decision. And he beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It was very, very beautiful area. Now they're right up on the Judean hills, and they're looking down over the plain of Jordan, which was some 2,000 to 3,000 feet below them. And he saw that the plain below him was well watered everywhere. It was a really good slice of flat land, highly fertile. As it was well watered, it says, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So the record tells us what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. God destroyed it. Not before this, but after. Even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. Well, Zoar was on a floodplain in Egypt. And floodplains are always highly fertile, good country. Well, Sodom and Gomorrah were in a plain, and it was like that sort of territory. Excellent landing. And Lot thought to himself, goodness me, if I can have a slice of that, then why would I want to be up here in the hills where half of it's rock and the other half is pretty dry grass and it's not very thick? You know, New Zealand is one of the only countries I've ever known where you actually can graze on the top of the hills. It's fertile. The soil is so fertile that that's what you do, isn't it? You can put your sheep on the top of the hills and they'll still do all right. Well, that's unusual in the world. There's very few places you can even think like that. It has to be a well-watered plain to have that kind of power. And so he thought, why would I want to be up here and running into my uncle all the time, and whereas I could be down there and my sheep would multiply like crazy and I'd be a very wealthy man in a very short time. And besides, my wife likes the dress shops in the cities, and she has a taste for quite a lot of the things that other women like to have, and all those things which are advantageous perhaps in a city where there's all sorts of things being made by all sorts of people. So verse 11, he makes his choice. He shows him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other, which is tragic, because really they were of kindred nature. They had a kindred hope in the things that had been promised in their family, and now they were dividing, even though they were commonly among strangers. They separated themselves the one from the other. Abraham dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent towards Sodom. But other translations say that he pitched his tent in Sodom. Effectively, he became a man of the city of Sodom. But it says in verse 13, but the men of Sodom were exceptionally evil men. They were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. I just want to tell you, just before we go any further, see in verse 10 where it says, he beheld all the plain of Jordan. You'll see that word continues through that record. And it might just sound to us that the plain has got any old shape. You know, where's the borders of this plain? Well, it is actually a word called KIKKAR, K-I-K-K-A-R, and it's a Hebrew word. And it means essentially a circle. So it's used in all sorts of ways where a circle is involved. That's how it should be translated. For example, coins were often called KIKKAR because they were circular. And a loaf of bread was called sometimes a word related to KIKKAR because it was, in those days, a circular roll of bread. That's what the essential meaning of KIKKAR is. And it's used consistently. See again in verse 11, then Lot shows him all the circuit of Jordan. So that's the first major introduction we have to the story of Sodom of Gomorrah. Well, the cities that were in that plain are called Sodom and Gomorrah, but in chapter 14 we see that there were others that were there as well. And in chapter 14 and verse 1 it says, it came to pass that in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Ellasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns. Verse 2, Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shem-Eber, king of Zeboim, called Zeboim because there were sort of two Zeboim cities, and hence I-M, which means plural, on the end. And then there was the fifth one, king of Bela, which is Zoar. So Sodom and Gomorrah were obviously the two principal cities of about 5 cities that were just in that locale. And they were collected together in this verse. And they collected themselves together because these invading nations in verse 1, 4 of those, they came against this body of cities, included in which was Sodom and Gomorrah. If we come back to chapter 10, we will see that that's not the first time that those cities have been put together. In chapter 10 and in verse 19, it says, "And the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as thou comest to Gerar, unto Gazer, as thou goest unto Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim, even unto Lasha." So you can see that again, those cities are put together. They were in league with each other, and chapter 14 makes that very, very clear, that they got on well together on the same piece of ground, and they were prepared to defend each other. But they must have been significant too, mustn't they? They're mentioned in chapter 14, which means they weren't just short-term cities. They were significant cities that had a history of working together and probably a common way of life. They were quite thick, we might say, in their life together. If you come now to chapter 19, this is what the Bible said happened to those cities. This is when Lot now is comfortably situated in Sodom, and there came, it says in verse 1 of chapter 19, there came 2 angels to Sodom at even, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom. The gate of Sodom. It seems like there's one gate in Sodom then. There's at least one. And Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. Now it shows, doesn't it, that Lot was still a decent man and still had great respect to the servants of God, to these angels, which I don't know how he saw that they were angels, but he recognised that they were. He certainly did respect these men as being men of God. And he said to them, verse 2, "Behold now, my lords, turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night. Look, come in, have free accommodation, wash your feet, and ye shall rise up early and go on your ways." And they said, No, but we will abide in the street all night. And he pressed upon them greatly, and they turned in unto him, and entered into his house, and he made them a feast, and did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat. So Lot was, again, a man of considerable good spirit towards those who came. And he must have recognised these men as God-fearing, therefore he treated them in a right way. But before they lay down, the men of the city, verse 4, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young. It was a city-wide behaviour. All the people from every quarter, old and young. And they called unto Lot. Can you imagine this? What have we got? Several hundred people outside of his established home. He was a wealthy man. They called unto Lot and said unto him, "Where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them." And Lot went out at the door unto them, and shut the door after him. He was a very apprehensive man. Inside he had messengers from God. Outside he had a roaring mob that wanted to lynch them. Well, wanted to misbehave with them. Didn't ask for Lot's wife, did he? He asked the men that came into that place. That's where the name of that behaviour comes from. And said, "I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly." He still spoke respectfully to them. "Behold now, I have 2 daughters, which have not known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and do ye to them as is good in your eyes. Only unto these men do nothing. For therefore came they under the shadow of my roof." And then verse 9, he had to endure the rude comment of one of these men. "Stand back," and they said again, "This one fellow came in to sojourn, and he will needs be a judge. Now will we deal worse with thee than with them." And they pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and came near to break the door. But the men put forth their hand that is the angels, and pulled Lot into his own house, and shut the door. And the angels smote the men, verse 11, that they were at the door of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves to find the door. The record of the rest of the chapter, it comes to verse 23, when we see what God did to that city for such behaviour. The sun was risen upon the earth, verse 23, when Lot entered into Zoar. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. He overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and that which grew upon the ground. It was a remarkable destruction of a city without precedent. Never in Scripture had there been such an event, either before or after. He rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. We've had disturbances in Italy in recent times, or even in your own dear city. But nothing like this. Rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah. It's a direct divine judgment. It was brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities. Notice the terms. He just turned them upside down. And all the plain, there's the word KIKKAR, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. Verse 27, Abraham from a distance saw the calamity. He got up early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord, and he thought about Lot. He looked towards Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain, and beheld, and lo, the smoke of the country went up as the smoke of a furnace. It had devoured, as it were, the rubbish, and all that was left of it was smoke. It came to pass when God destroyed, verse 29, the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in the which Lot dwelt. Well, that's the record that's given Sodom its history, and how do we make from that record whether these things really happened, or how would we find the evidence that these things really happened? Well, I want to show you a few things tonight from the site of that very place. I mentioned to you before that it wasn't a plain as a level ground so much as it was a circular plain. You know, when my sister was about 10 years of age, she was given from Sunday school a book which was called Everyday Life in the Holy Land. Probably some of the older folk here tonight might have got something similar. And I looked up that book just a couple of years ago, and you know, everything we're seeing here tonight is exactly in that book. In other words, people did come to realise, I don't know how long for or when they did, but that area was the area of the plain of Jordan where it's spoken of in Genesis chapter 13 and Genesis chapter 19. And it was called in that Sunday school book, it was called the KIKKAR of Jordan, and specified in no unmistakable terms that it was the place of Sodom and Gomorrah. I wonder how that knowledge was lost in the following century, because archaeologists were all at dispute about this even 15, 20 years ago, still talking about, you know, that peninsula down off the Dead Sea. It's interesting, isn't it? The evidence was put in the cupboard and lost. But the people who wrote that book knew about that evidence way back as far as that. Now, if you come back to that chapter 13, in the first of our slides tonight, you'll see the outline of the Dead Sea and that little peninsula that we've spoken of. And that's where it was thought that they were. But what we're saying is that at the top of that Dead Sea, there is a general circle. And that's the area that Abraham and Lot were looking down upon when they were in the hill country of Judea on the left and to the north. Now, if you think about just that slide itself, if you were on the top of that cliff, you would never see something down here at the bottom of the Dead Sea, would you? The very cliff itself on this side would cut your view out with after you saw just a very little bit of the top of the Dead Sea. It was as obvious as anything could be that was not the place that Lot was interested in. As obvious as it possibly could be. And that's really what has come to be recognised. There's the KIKKAR, and known as the KIKKAR of Jordan. It's a circular piece of land. It's not an exact circle, but it's a general circle of land that is flat and very fertile indeed. To this day, it's very fertile. If you've come from Jordan into Israel, you may have recognised when you came through at that low level, just above the Dead Sea, that it is very fertile, isn't it? Still to this day. And Jericho shares that KIKKAR on the western side of the circle. And up there where it says Bethel and Ai, that's where Abraham went, and he made his altar again and prayed unto God when he came out of Egypt. So you can see just, the average person can see just as a matter of common sense, that it was not down the bottom of the Dead Sea at all. It was something that was much more obvious to all concerned. And so that's what troubled the people that started to look into this about 10 years ago. And they came to the conclusion that a great mistake had been made. That's just a blow-up of the same thing. Southern Jordan Valley on this side is the Jordan Valley running down, and here's Jericho, and in that other half were the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and so on. Why did they think that it might be the place? Because in that same place, there were all kinds of, we call them tells. In fact, the archaeologists, just to be a little bit smarter than us, they call them tolls now, but we'll call them tells because we always have called them tells, haven't we? An archaeological site that just looks like a mound. You don't know what's underneath it. Well, they found there was a whole nest of these on the eastern side. In fact, one of them was huge. It was almost as large as any other tell that had been hitherto discovered. And yet it had no name. A lot of old cities have been found, but if they're anything like that size, they had a name, whether it was Hazel or wherever it might have been in Israel, north or south, one side of the river Jordan or the other side. They all had names by this stage, but these didn't have names, which was curious to those who were investigating. And so they did the same thing that we've done tonight. They looked from up at the position of Bethel and Ai and said, well, what would they be able to see? Could they see land right down the bottom? Of course they couldn't. What would they see? They'd see the land that was immediately in front of them, beneath their feet, as it were, 3,000 feet below in the Jordan Valley. And there, cutting out some of the other little dots that are around about the place, there was the principal cities, or the principal dots, I should say, which they found. Now, they've given them names there. Of course, they didn't find names on them. But nevertheless, they made a pattern. And the more they looked at the pattern, they could see that one was much, much bigger than any of the others. But the second one was Gomorrah, and that too was large. Then there was another one, which they thought must be Admah, and there were two little cities that were so close they could have been twins. Hence the IM for the fact that they were plural, the Zeboim. And they thought, well, what goes against this? Nothing went against it. Everything fell into place. The obvious next thing to do was to get down there and start to discover what's underneath the coating, the present coating of this place. So that's what we're doing tonight. And there in a very old atlas, if you can see it, at the top of the Dead Sea, it says, Plain of the 5 cities. Now that's telling us again, this is a very old atlas. I'm not absolutely sure, but it was from the 1880s, it says here. That means that they did know. Whoever put that atlas out was cognizant that it was generally called the Plain of the 5 cities. Like that book I was telling you that was given as a reward at Sunday school. The person who wrote that obviously knew the same story. Why was that information lost? Because people didn't want it. And it had become very awkward to say that Sodom and Gomorrah got the treatment that they got from God. I'm sure that's the reason why the information was lost. Embarrassing information is often lost. Ask the Americans. Well, that's what you see from the eastern side. We're looking west. So we're on the rise that would go up to Jordan, and we're looking at the size of that. Now, dear friends, dear folks, that's a huge place, isn't it? To say we can't have any knowledge as to what that place is just almost absurd. What tell is in all the archaeological areas? As large as that, the answer is very few indeed. And what, this has no designation? Nobody knows what it was? The idea was ridiculous. And that's what the archaeologists began to realise, that really this is ridiculous. This is a massive place. You know, they've been working on that for 10 years, and they reckon that they've uncovered about 1% of it in 10 years. So it's a 50-year project at the best. They go back every year and do more and more, and it's turning out more and more remarkable things to them. So the evidence is growing, and I think this is really, really remarkable. It's like that story of Nineveh and Babylon taking all the material back and putting it in the eye of the modern world, in the best museums they had. That's what this is doing. It's doing exactly the same thing. It's taking evidence, overwhelming evidence, that Sodom and Gomorrah existed and went out of existence in the most peculiar and remarkable way. That's no ordinary tell, indeed. That's looking at it from the other side. Again, you can see it's a massive site, isn't it? And is it well watered? It certainly is. Banana palms all around the place. Beautiful orchards and so on. On the other side across there is Jericho, which was always known for its fertility. There they are working. This is no pie-in-the-sky idea. These people are down to work. They're doing it the professional way. They find some little object, they pull out their brush and they brush around and do it perfectly because they want to keep the evidence. No, it's being done absolutely as the masters of archaeology would say it should be done. And so these are the things that have been found in that site. This lady seems to have found some origin of coin pieces, of golden coin pieces. And you can see from the other photo that they're really working, aren't they? This is a big and remarkable project. It's no amateur thing at all. They're doing it all the right way and putting in hundreds of hours, very often of voluntary work, to make it clear that this is what is happening. That's just a little bit more on the Hebrew word. In the Old Testament, Hebrew refers most often, over 50 times, to a talent of metal or a circular flat loaf of bread. Of course, it isn't a loaf of bread. It's called a KIKKAR because it's a circular piece of land. Now we go up to Bethel and Ai, and we did what Abraham and Lot did. We do what they did. Before us, by the way, is Jericho. But you can see that plain is anything but barren. It's a well-watered plain indeed to this very day. Interesting, because Jericho had a spring that Elisha had brought to life again. And so Jericho is always known to have all that growth when you're there. It is very verdurous. It really is in Jericho. But the other place has got no such given spring like that. But it is just naturally, it is very, very fertile. That's where our tills are found. Now, if you look south, instead that last one was straight direct east. But if you look southeast, that's what you see. How much of the Dead Sea can you see? Well, it might be best part of a mile if you're lucky. You're not going to see anything of the Dead Sea. You're 50 miles away from it. And that's what they saw. They were 50 miles from seeing anything down the bottom of the Dead Sea. But they could see just a touch of the Dead Sea. And the plain was all up in this direction. So the picture grows, doesn't it? The certainty of the picture grows upon us, and I think it's exciting that it does, really. It nominates in the scriptures the area of Canaan, and it says from Sodom to Gaza, which is the western length, and it nominates also from Lasha, which is at the top there, down here to Bethel. And that's the area of Canaan. And as it describes it, it says that it's alongside the bottom of Canaan. It was alongside, or as you come to Sodom and Gomorrah. I think the case is overwhelming, isn't it? It's just no other place it could possibly be. And everything's pointing to that. We won't spend too much time on the rest of these details, but just to get that clearly in our mind, Tel el-Hamman is the name of Sodom, and Tel Nimrim is the name of Gomorrah. The others, they fit so well with that neat little description that we had in Genesis 13 and 19. Again, we don't need to really study on that. You can see the circular concept that's involved. There's Tel el-Hamman again. You can see the banana groves, banana orchard, if that's the right word for bananas. You can see it spreading along the side, and it's beautiful. And there's the Great Tel. It was obviously a considerable sized city. It's going to take a vast amount of work to get to the bottom of all that. Whether you need to get to the bottom might be debated, but the evidence is overwhelming already in the things that have been pulled up. Looking at it from the other side, there it is again. I find it really almost humorous that men have found all sorts of finicky little things in archaeology by running up into some little crevice or something to find something or other that might be of spurious interest, and yet they couldn't tell us what that was. But I don't think there's anyone in the room that wouldn't be able to say pretty evenly already that that's got to be the place. The evidence of the destruction, well, it's coming to them all the time. Every time they go back each year, and they come back and do several months' work. And what they find is that there is the sense of an overthrow. It's not the sense of invasion. They haven't seen anything that indicates an invasion at all. But they very often find remnants of mankind under a layer of ash that sometimes is something like 15 inches high. Well, you just don't get to 15 inches of ash from just the fire in a city, do you? So that is when God overthrew it with brimstone and fire. There was something added to it that came down from above when God overthrew those cities. And there again, it's just been overthrown, just lapped over. As God overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities. And the archaeologists say we never see ruins like that. And there, would you believe it, is some of the many remains of mankind that they have found in those places. Not sort of like you do in the ruins of the volcano in Italy, there's never ever any evidence that they were sort of running for the gate like we found in those ruins. There's ruins that indicate they were still like just caught where they were, as you would expect from the way it is described. Quite different, they say, to anything they've seen in Italy. Very interesting, marvellously interesting. And it said that Lot was sitting in the gate. Not a lot of details, but it says the gate. I would have thought a place like that had a number of gates. Would you believe it? They have found a gate. And there it is. So they looked at the foundations of the gate, and I don't know the details of archaeology to that point, but what they're saying is that that's exactly the style that was in vogue at that particular time in that particular area. So if your imagination is good, you can see Lot sitting there in the gate among the elders of Sodom, giving adjudication on matters related to their behaviour. There is a gate there, and they found it. They were very, very excited when they found that. They have not found another gate in any other place. And there is evidence of something that has just collapsed and fallen over, as they described it. It's not of invasion, it's not of earthquake, it's of something that has just been forced and overthrown, as God describes it. How remarkable. City wall there, and there's sort of a gate in it, but it's not in the right place at all. And there's what they're now able to build up. You know how the archaeologists do? They get the lower stones and they can build up in some way. They have some idea too of how large and high the building might have been. This is their sketch as they see it. And you might notice who did this sketch. Our brother Lane Rittmeyer was very signal to this whole matter. He's done all of the archaeological drawings related to it, and he's quite an authority on it. It's very thrilling, I think, to find that Christadelphian has been involved in it. This is another city that has been unearthed, a city called Knossos, and many of the similarities of structure in this were found in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, which was in a kindred time of occupation. Well, if we come to the words of the New Testament, it does give us a feeling of great responsibility, because Jesus commented upon this city, so did the Apostle Peter, and so did Jude the Apostle. Let's come and have a look at those words that they say. In the 17th chapter of Luke, we have the words of the Lord Jesus Christ. Did he believe that Sodom existed? He most certainly did. So in verse 28 of Luke 17, likewise he said, also, as it was in the days of Lot, they did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded. And they certainly did, didn't they? A vast place. But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Sodom and Gomorrah existed. And when they left, God rained fire and brimstone, which is exactly how the archaeologists are seeing the remnant. Even thus, he says, shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. Now, if people today are going to press ahead with the behaviour of the Sodomites, of Sodom and Gomorrah, then they are inviting, are they not, the wrath of Almighty God? And even our own attitudes in seeing all of those things happening need to be adjusted so that we are really in favour of what God is saying. It's not a matter of current legislation and what the current generation might think about it. It hasn't changed a wrinkle. In fact, it's worse today. It's more sophisticated. It's gone right into the centre of government legislation. It's worse. And they're proud of it. As a matter of fact, the person who doesn't agree is the man who is on the outside today. far worse than it ever was in Sodom and Gomorrah. What does God think of our generation? Sometimes it's frightening to contemplate it. Here's Peter's comment. 2 Peter chapter 2, perhaps verse 5, to bring us in. And spared not the old world, but saved Noah the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. So it was in Noah's day. Did Peter believe in the flood? Of course he did. But he believed in Sodom and Gomorrah too. Verse 6, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes. Remember what I said before? You'll find 15 inches of ashes and no stones above them, and just remnants of people and whatever underneath them. You don't find archaeological sites like that. The reason is that he turned those cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes and condemned them with an overthrow, same word, isn't it, as Genesis chapter 19, making them an ensample unto those that after should live ungodly. Look at those words. How powerful they are to our generation. And delivered righteous Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked. And so Lot was apparently saved out of those circumstances because he himself personally had not corrupted. Well, that righteous man, verse 8, dwelling among them in seeing and hearing, vexed his righteous soul from day to day with the ungodly deeds of Sodom and Gomorrah. There's us. We should be vexed by what we hear and not just accepting it as, well, that's where the world is. We just have to get used to it and agree with it. Those that are on God's side will be the ones that will be on his side when the earth is judged. And finally, in the Epistle to Jude, further on in our New Testament, it says here in verse 7 of Jude, even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh. God made a wife for Adam, one wife, and set forth for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. Likewise, also these filthy dreamers defile the flesh, despise dominion, and speak evil of dignities. All of that kind of behaviour is so prevalent and growing in our society. So archaeology is again doing its good job in bringing to us evidence, very clear evidence, very convicting evidence of what was Sodom and Gomorrah and what God did with them, and what he will therefore do with the same behaviour that's seen in our world today, so we know where we should be. Thank you.